Before Sally Ride became America's first woman astronaut, before Jackie Cochran became the first woman to break the sound barrier, and before Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly the Atlantic, there was another great American woman aviator. She was in fact the first American woman to earn a pilot's license, and her name was Harriet Quimby. Harriet was born near Coldwater, Michigan, to William and Ursula Quimby on May 11, 1875. In 1884, the Quimby family moved to Arroyo Grande, California. Later, the family moved to Los Gatos, and then to San Francisco. To help Harriet rise quickly in society, her mother devised stories that Harriet had received much of her education in Europe. Harriet herself maintained this illusion for the rest of her life. In her 20s, Quimby began working as a reporter for the San Francisco Dramatic Review and for the Sunday edition of the Call Bulletin and Chronicle. In 1903, she moved to New York City, where she soon convinced the publisher of Leslie's Weekly to let her write for the magazine. According to the Reader's Companion to American History, Leslie's was America's first successful illustrated news weekly. While in New York, Quimby climbed the journalistic ladder quite quickly, becoming by 1906 a drama critic and editor for Leslie's. In October of 1910, Quimby's friend Matilda Moisant invited her to attend the International Aviation Tournament at Belmont Park Racetrack in Queens, New York. This tournament was the first of 3 annual meets held there and involved aeronautical competitions and prizes. Over 25 top aviators competed in the tournament, including Roland Garros from France, Claude Graham-White from Great Britain, and Glenn Curtis from Hammondsport, New York. Americans dominated the tournament, but near the end of the meet, Graham-White won the Gordon Bennett Cup speed race. The tournament's final event, an aerial race from the park to the Statue of Liberty and back again, attracted thousands of spectators. The prize for that race originally went to John Moisant, a local aviator and Matilda's brother. Ironically, officials later disqualified him as winner for starting late, not early, and gave the prize to the Count de Lesseps. Attending the event fired Quimby's interest in learning to fly, so she made plans to take flight lessons with Moisant at his aviation school in Mineola, New York. Unfortunately, on December 31, 1910, he died in an airplane crash in New Orleans, Louisiana. Coincidentally, that same day, another aviation pioneer, Arch Hoxsey, also died in a crash. Undeterred by either man's death, Harriet and Matilda started taking flying lessons at the Moisant School in the spring of 1911. Quimby's trainer was André Huppert, who had received his flight training from none other than Louis Blériot, the famed French flyer. Quimby started recording observations about her flying experiences. In a May 1911 issue of Leslie's Weekly, she published her first aviation article, entitled How a Woman Learns to Fly. The article began with a brief discussion of the garb a woman might need for safe and comfortable flight. For example, a woman wanting to fly would need, said Quimby, to abandon skirts and don a knickerbocker uniform. The design of Quimby's own flight suit grew out of advice received from, so she said, the president of the American Tailors Association, Alexander M. Green. This suit was, according to Quimby, made of thick wool-back satin without lining. It is all in one piece, including the hood. In 1911, airplanes were still in their infancy, and pilot training in those days bore only a rough resemblance to today's instruction. Nevertheless, pilot training at the Moisant Aviation School followed a carefully established procedure. Students first received a week of shop instruction, which included adjusting to the dirty environs of early aircraft. Next, they learned how to run up the engine to takeoff speed while staying on the ground. After that, they learned to pilot the aircraft down a runway for about 1 mile and then take off for short hops. Finally, students learned to take simple flights around the field, make turns, fly figure eights, and land within a specified distance. On August 1, 1911, Quimby took her pilot's test for a second time and earned for herself the first pilot's license for an American woman and only the second women's license in the world overall. Just 12 days later, Matilda Moisant became the second American woman to earn a license. Quimby was eager to show off her newfound flying skills. For example, on September 4th, scarcely a month after receiving her license, she flew over a crowd of 15,000 spectators in Staten Island, New York, becoming the first woman in history to fly at night. In October, as part of the Moisant International Aviators exhibition team, both Harriet and Matilda traveled by steamship to Mexico to perform during inaugural celebrations for the new Mexican president, Francisco Madero. By her own account, Quimby flew over the castle of Chapultepec and dropped flowers in honor of the president. As part of the celebrations, she became the first woman to fly over Mexico City. Back in 1909, Louis Blériot had piloted an airplane across the English Channel, becoming the first man to do so. While in Mexico, Quimby decided that she wanted to be the first of her sex to accomplish the same feat. As with many other aviation firsts, competition for this honor was keen. Therefore, she kept her plans for her flight secret. According to the U.S. Centennial of Flight Commission, only Blériot and a few other people knew of her plan. On March 7, 1912, Quimby quietly boarded the ocean liner America and headed for England. Once in that country, she traveled to London to arrange financing for her flight with one of the city's newspapers. She then went to Paris, where she met with Blériot himself. From him she borrowed an airplane, shipped it back to England by boat, and then made her own way back to England. Tuesday, April 16th, was a day clear enough for flying, so Quimby drove herself from her local Dover hotel to the takeoff ground. An associate named Gustav Hamel took a quick flight test in the Blériot aircraft to ensure that it was ready for Quimby's attempt at history. Quimby then climbed into the craft, took off around 5:30 a.m., and headed in the general direction of Calais, France. Over the channel she flew into a fog bank. However, with the aid of a compass tucked in her lap, she found her way across the cloudy channel and landed on a beach in Hardelot, France, a town 8 miles south of Boulogne. Local citizens, realizing they had just witnessed an historic flight, carried Quimby off the beach shoulder high. Although this was the first time that Quimby had flown the Blériot plane, used a compass, or flown over any large body of water, she now was the first woman ever to pilot an airplane across the English Channel. Since heavier-than-air flight was only 8 years old, such a feat normally would have been front-page news in papers across America and Europe. However, just 2 days before Quimby's flight, the RMS Titanic had sunk, making shocking headlines. On the very day of her flight, for example, the New York Times headline shouted news of the shipping disaster in 3 lines of inch-high capital letters. Follow-up stories about the sinking dominated the press for weeks. On April 17th, the day after her triumph, Quimby's feet had to settle for a short article on page 15 of America's paper of record. After her history-making flight, Quimby steamed back to the United States and started making plans for even more flying adventures. For example, U.S. Postmaster General Frank Hitchcock authorized her to fly some U.S. mail from Boston to New York on the last day of the 3rd annual Boston Aviation Meet. Completing such a flight would make her the first woman ever to fly the U.S. mail. In late June, the meet opened in Squantum, Massachusetts. Beside Quimby, other aviation pioneers at the meet included Lincoln Beechey, America's most famous stunt flyer prior to World War I, and Blanche Scott, the first American woman ever to make a solo hop in an airplane. At the meet, rumors abounded that Quimby and Claude Graham White might engage in an aerial race. Unfortunately, she never raced Graham White and never flew America's mail. Instead, at 6 p.m. on July 1st, she took off with a passenger in her Blériot airplane, which had a reputation for unevenness in flight and flew out over water. As she headed back to shore, the plane suddenly tipped forward, and her passenger, the aviation meet's manager, fell out of the craft. The plane then righted itself, but then tipped forward again. This time, despite wearing some sort of safety belt, she too fell out. Quimby's passenger drowned in the water below. She hit the mudflats and died, and the airplane then crashed upside down. On July 1st and the days just following, debate ensued as to why the accident had occurred. Some people speculated that a control cable had snagged and sent the aircraft out of control. Still others thought that Quimby's passenger might have leaned forward to compliment her on the flight and upset the already unsteady machine. Quimby's death came at age 37, just 11 months after she had earned her pilot's license. Her body now rests in Kensico Cemetery in Valhalla, New York, just a few miles north of the aerodrome where she first learned to fly.